No one recognized the scruffy old man with a grey beanie pulled low over his forehead as the very person holding the fate of the bank they crowded into every day. On a bitterly cold morning, in a worn-out fabric coat, he stood in front of the teller's window, eyes tired but unwavering. No one knew that he was Arthur Callahan, owner of Riverstone Trust, a family bank spanning 3 generations with assets worth over $1.8 billion. Arthur wasn't there to withdraw pocket money. He was there searching for something he had lost trust for months. Arthur had noticed numbers that didn't add up. Customer complaints increased. Strange interest rates appeared, and unnamed fees popped up. Yet board meetings were still filled with colourful slides and fake smiles insisting everything's fine. Arthur knew the truth didn't live in the boardroom. It lived in the way people looked each other in the eye at the teller's window. That day, he came to withdraw $45,000 in cash at a time when the system was running normally after making an appointment. But the look in the young teller's eyes was anything but normal. Contempt, suspicion, then fear. And finally, the order for security to drag him out of his own bank, under the stares of strangers who saw him as nothing but a washed-up old thief. Arthur stood on the cold sidewalk, the midday sun cutting across his face, no longer feeling pain, only one question racing through his mind. They fear me. But what is it they fear being exposed inside? He pulled out his phone and called Miriam Lewis, the attorney who had been by his side for 30 years. Miriam, let's begin. From today on, we're going to find the truth. That night, Arthur's office was so quiet you could hear the ticking of the old wooden clock on the wall, reminding him that time waits for no one, not even those fighting against lies. At the desk, Miriam Lewis, his companion of 3 decades and his trusted attorney, flipped through stacks of account statements from Riverstone West, the very branch that had kicked Arthur out like a stranger. "Look at this, Arthur," Miriam said, her voice low, dark circles under her eyes from sleepless nights. "This man, Henry Lewis, he passed away 8 months ago, yet his account has been making transactions almost every week." Arthur looked at the numbers printed on the paper, each transaction line cold under the lamp's light. It was the account of Henry Lewis, a retired engineer who had entrusted all his retirement savings to the bank, believing it would take care of his wife, Clara Lewis, after he was gone. Yet now, the account showed shady transactions, special management fees, investment consulting fees, premium customer service. Arthur knew well that the bank had no such fees for the deceased. He felt his heart tighten, not because of the money, but because of a promise his grandfather had made when passing down the bank. "You must protect the trust of those who place their life savings here." "Arthur," Arthur whispered, eyes locked on the £4,827 withdrawn from Henry Lewis's account just the week before. "They've taken money from the dead." Miriam remained silent, placing her thin but warm hand on his shoulder. "There may be more. This is just one account." Arthur closed his eyes, his breathing slow, the wrinkles on his forehead deepening further. In that moment, he remembered Clara's eyes in the branch lobby, the tear shimmering as she looked up at him being dragged away by security, her lips mouthing, "I'm sorry," but unable to form the words. He whispered, "Miriam, we can't let them keep doing this." That same night, Miriam contacted an independent audit team, people who had helped Arthur through mergers, lawsuits, and covert investigations before. They gathered around the table, laptop screens glowing, illuminating tired yet determined faces. Each person had a role, one reviewing statements, one analyzing transaction patterns, another checking employee logins, another comparing transaction times with employee work schedules. The clacking of keyboard keys blended with the steady rain tapping on the window. Outside, cars passed, leaving fleeting trails of light, while inside, the numbers kept appearing, every dollar taken from accounts belonging to those who could no longer stand up for themselves. A young auditor, eyes shadowed with exhaustion, let out a soft exclamation. "I've found 3 more accounts, also belonging to deceased customers, with recurring suspicious transactions." Miriam turned to Arthur. "See that it's not just one. They've been doing this to many." Arthur clenched his fist, his eyes lighting up with resolve. He knew that from this moment, his battle was no longer about business. It was a fight for truth and justice. He stood up, walked to the window, looking out at the yellow light spilling onto the empty street. In the glass, he saw the reflection of an old man with silver hair, aged by years of keeping a promise, now ready to uphold that promise until his last breath. "We're going to pull back this curtain, for Clara, for Henry, for all those who trusted this bank." "Miriam." Miriam nodded, adjusting her brown scarf, her voice soft yet firm. "And we'll start with Lucas Graham." In that moment, a flash of lightning lit up the room, reflecting in Arthur's determined eyes. He knew that if he wanted to reclaim trust, he had to begin by exposing the traitor. In the pale yellow light of the next morning, Arthur sat quietly in his small home office, Miriam leaning over beside him, looking at the laptop screen, her reading glasses slipping down her nose. On the screen appeared a face, Lucas Graham, branch manager of Riverstone West, a bright face, hair slicked back with gel, a confident smile in the HR photo on the internal report. Miriam pointed to the corner of the screen, where a security video clip was playing. "Do you see this, Arthur? This is when you walked into the branch yesterday." The footage shook slightly, but was clear enough to see Arthur in his old coat, stepping through the door, gripping his thin wallet. At that moment, behind the glass, Lucas Graham stood by his office window, phone in hand, eyes fixed on Arthur. Seconds later, Lucas turned away, his lips moving as he spoke into the phone. "He called security the moment you stepped in, even before you spoke to the teller," Miriam said softly, her eyes darkening. Arthur looked at Lucas's face in the video, his eyes squinting slightly, fingers tapping lightly on the window frame, his lips pressed into a thin line. That was not the reaction of a branch manager seeing a stranger withdraw money, but the fear of a man sensing a storm about to break. Arthur took a deep breath. He knew who I was from the very first moment. Miriam lifted her gaze to Arthur, her eyes reflecting a mix of empathy and determination. "He's afraid of you, Arthur, not because you're the chairman, but because your presence threatens what he's hiding." The ticking of the clock echoed, and Arthur looked at the black-and-white photo of his grandfather on the wall, the eyes of the man who built this bank seeming to follow Arthur's every step. Grandfather, if you were alive today, what would you do? Arthur whispered. In that moment, he realized he needed something he had forgotten during his years in the executive chair to step into the fray himself. Miriam placed her hand on his shoulder. Light but firm. Arthur, it's time for us to act. I'll contact the legal team and file a request for a full internal audit of Riverston West. Arthur nodded, his eyes not leaving the screen as Lucas in the video walked out of his office, phone in hand, lips moving rapidly, his smile gone, replaced with visible worry. Just then, a small sound chimed, and the phone beside the laptop lit up. A message from an unknown number. You need to know the truth. Don't trust anyone at the branch. Arthur frowned, calling the number back, but the line was dead. He read the message again and again, a chill creeping into his chest. Someone is watching everything. Miriam. She nodded, her eyes filled with understanding, and someone at the branch still has a conscience. Arthur stood up, put on his coat, adjusted his hat, his eyes now burning with the fire of the youth that once fought boldly in the business world. We're going to Riverstone West. At the moment before leaving, Arthur turned back to Miriam. I don't have many years left to make this right, Miriam, but if I can, I will restore the integrity of this bank for those who believed in it. Miriam gave a gentle smile, picking up her briefcase, her voice steady. I'm with you, Arthur. The car rolled forward, leaving the quiet street behind, under the faint glow of dawn. Inside the vehicle, Arthur opened his phone, looking at a photo of himself with his late wife on the day they opened their first branch, the same branch where Clara and Henry had once made their final transactions. He clenched his fist. For them. Arthur, don't give up. Outside the window, the city began to wake, but Arthur knew a different kind of awakening was about to begin inside Riverstone West, where the truth could no longer be hidden. When Arthur and Miriam stepped into the lobby of Riverstone West that morning, everything seemed normal. Customers lined up, receipt printers humming steadily, employees chatting softly as they processed transactions. But Arthur felt an invisible tension in the air, like a wire pulled so tight it was ready to snap at any moment. At the far end of the teller line, Clara Lewis was carefully counting small bills for an elderly woman whose hands were trembling. Her eyes were gentle, patient, even though the corners were lined with the exhaustion of too many years. Arthur stood still, watching her for a long moment. This was the wife of Henry Lewis, the man who had trusted this bank until the very last day of his life, only to have his name exploited for shady transactions. When Arthur's eyes met Clara's, she flinched, gripping the receipt in her hand. For a brief moment, her eyes flickered with guilt and fear. She lowered her head, avoiding his gaze, but her frail shoulders shook. Miriam, she knows something, Arthur whispered. They waited until the crowd thinned out, and then Arthur stepped up to Clara's window, looking her straight in the eyes. Mrs. Clara, I am Arthur Callahan. Her eyes widened, tears threatening to spill over, her voice raspy. I know who you are, Mr. Callahan." Arthur nodded gently, speaking in a low, controlled voice. "We need to talk. For Henry." The elderly woman stood frozen for a few seconds before she quietly nodded. She asked permission to step away from the counter, leading Arthur and Miriam into a small break room in the back, where an old photograph of Henry in his military uniform hung on the wall, his face beaming with youthful pride. Clara sat down, clasping her hands tightly. I didn't know what to do. When Henry passed, I submitted all the paperwork to close his account. But a few months later, I started hearing whispers around the branch that someone was using old accounts to clean the books. She looked at Arthur, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I asked questions, but management told me to stay out of it. They said if I opened my mouth, I would lose my job. I still have rent to pay. I was scared." Arthur gently placed his hand over her frail, trembling hands, his voice warm and steady. "Mrs. Clara, you are not to blame. The ones at fault are those who forced you into silence." Clara broke into sobs, her hands shaking. "Henry worked his whole life to leave me a little something, and I never imagined they would use his name to deceive others. I'm sorry, Mr. Callahan. I am so sorry." Arthur felt his heart tighten as he watched this elderly woman weeping in the small room, realizing just how far the bank had strayed in its race for profit. "Mrs. Clara, I promise you, this will end, and no one else will be exploited again." She looked up at him, her eyes glinting with a sliver of hope. "Will you really be able to do that?" Arthur squeezed her hand gently. "For Henry, for you, and for everyone who trusted us. I will." As Arthur and Miriam stepped out of the break room, they saw Lucas Graham standing in the hallway, his eyes flickering with irritation when he saw Arthur with Clara. Lucas gave a cold smile, adjusting his tie. "Mr. Callahan, I don't know what you're doing with Mrs. Clara, but we're quite busy." Arthur looked him straight in the eye, his voice calm but cold as steel. "Lucas, what are you hiding?" Lucas shrugged, his mouth curling into a smirk. "I don't know what you're talking about, sir." Arthur didn't reply, simply staring into him. For a moment, Lucas flinched, his eyes darting away before he turned and strode back to his office, slamming the door behind him. Miriam whispered beside him, "Did you see that? He's afraid." Arthur nodded, determination lighting up his eyes. "Afraid of the truth, Miriam, and we're going to make him face it." He turned back to look at Clara, who stood at the counter wiping away her tears, adjusting her uniform, trying to offer a small smile to the next customer walking in. Arthur understood there were people who chose to stand tall even while they were hurting, and they deserved to be protected. She is the soul of this bank. Miriam. Not the numbers, not the profit reports. It's the quiet people who hold on to honesty. Miriam gave a gentle smile, her eyes glistening. "And we will fight for people like her." That evening, a light rain fell, cold wind sweeping through the empty streets. Arthur sat by the window, watching the yellow streetlights casting long shadows on the sidewalk. At the table, Miriam was reviewing the plan they had finalized with the legal team and the independent investigation unit. "Arthur, this is the only way," Miriam said, her voice firm. Arthur nodded, his eyes drifting toward the empty chair in the corner of the room where his late wife used to sit reading while he worked late. He whispered, "Darling, watch me do this, not for power, but for the people who believed in this bank." The next morning at 7:30 a.m., Arthur stepped out of the black SUV, adjusting his coat, gripping the file of evidence tightly. Miriam and two members of the investigation team walked alongside him, tension etched on all their faces. Riverstone West opened its doors under a grey sky. Lucas Graham still stood at the manager's desk, his suit perfectly pressed, a professional smile plastered on his face, but his eyes blinked rapidly, betraying his anxiety as he saw Arthur enter. Arthur walked straight to the reception, his voice clear. "I need to see Lucas Graham, immediately." Lucas stepped out, forcing a thin smile. "Mr. Callahan, how can I assist you today?" Arthur looked him straight in the eye. "We need to talk about the dead accounts that are still active." Lucas's face drained of color for a split second before he tried to recover. I don't know what you're referring to." Miriam slammed the thick file onto the counter, her voice sharp as a blade. "Mr. Lucas, these are the records of withdrawals, phantom transaction fees, and suspicious transfers from 4 accounts belonging to confirmed deceased clients." Lucas swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room, sweat breaking out on his forehead. This must be a system error. Maybe an employee input mistake." Arthur stepped closer, lowering his voice, each word ringing clear. "Lucas, you know this isn't a system error. You were afraid when I showed up that day because if I had successfully withdrawn the money, your entire phantom transaction scheme would have unraveled." Lucas fell silent, his hands trembling, his lips moving without sound. At that moment, the door swung open and 2 investigators entered, accompanied by 3 bank security officers. Miriam held up the emergency audit order, her voice echoing across the lobby. "By emergency audit order of the Riverstone Trust Board of Directors and in cooperation with federal investigators, we are freezing all transaction systems at this branch and requiring Mr. Lucas Graham to cooperate fully." Customers turned, whispers rippling through the room. Lucas panicked, stepping back, his hands raised. "Everyone, you're misunderstanding. I was just following orders." Arthur stepped forward, his eyes calm but icy. "Whose orders?" Lucas stared at Arthur, fear flooding his eyes, then suddenly turned to run. "Hold him," Miriam commanded. 2 security officers immediately restrained Lucas, pulling him back in front of Arthur. Cries and small gasps filled the lobby as everyone realized the branch manager was being detained. Lucas struggled, screaming, "You don't understand. It's not just me. You're stirring up a hornet's nest." Arthur tilted his head slightly, his gaze cold. "Then I'll tear down the entire nest, Lucas." Lucas collapsed into a chair, sweat pouring down, breathing heavily before looking up at Arthur, breaking down in tears. I just wanted to pay off my debts, to keep my position. They told me if I did what they said, I'd get promoted. Arthur looked at him, a flicker of pity rising before he quickly pushed it away. You betrayed everyone who trusted this bank, and you will pay for it. The audit team began sealing off computers, safes, and backing up all data while employees watched in shocked silence. Across the lobby, Arthur saw Clara Lewis standing still, her hands clenched together, tears streaming down her cheeks. But her eyes shone with relief. Arthur walked over, placing a hand on her shoulder. We've started, Clara. No one will have to live in fear anymore. She sobbed quietly, looking at Arthur with grateful eyes. Thank you. Thank you for keeping your promise. Arthur turned back to Miriam, nodding. She squeezed his hand, her voice firm. This is only the beginning. We'll have to dig much deeper. Arthur. Arthur took a deep breath, his eyes blazing with resolve. I'm ready. For Henry, for Clara, and for everyone who believed in this bank. That night, Arthur's office lights burned late into the night, casting reflections onto the glass, his shadow standing still as he stared at reports, data, and statements printing non-stop. Miriam sat across the table, her silver hair falling forward, eyes dark with exhaustion but focused with unwavering intensity. She had just received a call from the independent investigation team and the bank's legal department. Arthur, Miriam said, her voice hoarse from hours of non-stop work. We have traced the source of the withdrawals. Arthur turned his chair, his face tense, eyes unblinking. Tell me, Miriam. She handed him a copy of the account statement. Pointing at the lines on the page, the name Henry Lewis appears in transfer transactions to multiple different accounts, all opened under fake identities with documents that were expertly forged. But there's one consistent pattern. Every single withdrawal happened on days when Lucas Graham personally approved the transactions. Arthur clenched the paper, the wrinkles on his hands deepening. Every number on that page stabbed at him like a blade, a reminder of the trust the bank had betrayed. How much in total? His voice was low, dry. Miriam swallowed hard, her voice trembling. Over $2.4 million in 2 years, from 4 accounts belonging to deceased clients. And we've discovered 3 more accounts that were about to be targeted next. Arthur closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his cheek. In that moment, he saw Clara Lewis wiping tears in the bank lobby, saw the elderly quietly signing to withdraw their retirement funds, saw the working poor entrusting their hard-earned savings to his bank. The ring of the telephone shattered the heavy silence. Miriam picked up. Yes, I'm here. She listened, nodding repeatedly, then handed the phone to Arthur. It's the investigation team. They've taken Lucas's statement. Arthur lifted the phone to his ear, silent for several minutes, his face slowly sinking. I understand. Thank you. He set the phone down. Looking directly at Miriam, Lucas has confessed. He said he wasn't the mastermind, just the executor, and the person behind it all. Arthur paused, his voice catching. It's Richard Malone. Miriam's eyes widened in shock. Richard Malone. The regional vice president. Arthur nodded. Richard Malone, the man who had worked beside him for over 15 years, the one who always said, "We will protect our customers." Arthur was the one who forced Lucas to approve fraudulent transactions, stealing from the deceased. Arthur walked over to the window, watching the rain patter against the pavement outside. His heart felt empty. A friend, a colleague, betraying everything. Miriam stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Arthur, this is not your fault, but now you need to be stronger than ever." Arthur turned back, his eyes red but burning with determination. "We will not stop. I want a full audit of the entire system, not just Riverstone West, but every branch. I want every deceased customer's account from the last 10 years checked." Miriam looked at him, giving a tired but resolute smile. "Understood. I'll prepare the emergency orders." That night, Arthur returned home. The house quiet, except for the ticking of the clock. He sat in his familiar armchair and pulled an old photograph from his wallet. His wife, his Clara, and himself, standing in front of the first Riverstone branch they opened over 40 years ago. He whispered, "My love, I didn't keep my promise. I let the greedy tear this place apart, but I will make it right." The next morning, as dawn broke, Arthur stood in front of the headquarters of Riverstone Trust. Employees paused when they saw him, their eyes filled with worry. Arthur smiled gently, nodding to them. He knew that to restore trust, he had to start with these very people. He stepped into the conference room, where the board of directors was already seated. Richard Malone in his usual spot, his face calm, fingers tapping lightly on the table. Arthur set the folder down on the table, looking Richard directly in the eye. His voice clear, ringing through the stillness of the room. "Richard, I know what you've done." The room fell silent. Only the pounding of Arthur's heart in his chest as he prepared to enter the fight of his life to protect the truth, the honor, and the trust of those who had placed their lives in this bank. The conference room of Riverstone Trust was unusually quiet that morning. The first light of day streamed through the windows, casting pale gold across the tense faces of branch managers, department heads, and the executive team seated around the polished wooden table. Arthur Callahan stood at the head, his back straight, his eyes sweeping across each person, pausing longer on the composed face of Richard Malone, the regional vice president he once trusted like a brother. Today, Arthur began, his voice echoing. "We're not here to discuss profit plans or branch expansions. We're here to talk about the truth." A heavy tension settled, the soft scrape of a chair shifting, the gentle tap of a pen on the table. Glances exchanged. Anxious, Arthur opened the folder, revealing pages dense with figures, images, transaction records. 4 accounts belonging to deceased clients were exploited, with over $2.4 million stolen. These transactions were approved by Lucas Graham, but Lucas wasn't the mastermind. He turned to Richard, locking eyes with him as they flickered. Uneasy. Lucas named you. Richard. A wave of whispers rolled through the room. Richard's mouth twitched into a smile, but it quivered. The confidence drained Arthur. You're going to believe a criminal's word to accuse me. Arthur didn't blink. I believe the numbers, Richard, and numbers don't lie. He nodded to Miriam, who stood, opening her laptop to project onto the large screen the transactions authorized under Richard's authority, perfectly matching the illicit withdrawals. Richard's hand clenched the armrest, veins bulging, his voice dropping into a growl. You don't understand, Arthur. I did this to save the bank. Arthur let out a dry, humorless laugh. Save the bank by stealing from the dead. You think you have the right to decide who deserves to keep their money and who doesn't. Richard shot to his feet, his eyes bloodshot. You don't understand the pressure from the board, from investors. I kept this bank alive through 3 financial crises. Arthur, and you sit here dreaming about your old-fashioned values. Arthur stepped forward, his footsteps steady, echoing in the tense silence, stopping directly in front of Richard, his voice low, every word precise. You didn't save this bank, Richard. You only saved yourself. Richard panted, his eyes darting around at the horrified faces of his colleagues. He collapsed into his chair, trembling, covering his face, his voice breaking. I didn't have a choice. Arthur looked at him, a brief flicker of pity passing through him before he clenched his fist. There's always a choice, Richard. And that choice is never to betray the trust of those who put their lives in this bank. Miriam stepped forward, placing the suspension order in front of Richard, her voice firm. Richard Malone, you are hereby suspended from your position, pending investigation and prosecution. Richard looked up, his eyes glistening, lips quivering. Arthur, I'm sorry. Arthur took a deep breath, his voice rough. Sorry doesn't return the money to those families. Sorry doesn't restore this bank's honor. Security escorted Richard out of the room, the sound of the door closing echoing, leaving a heavy silence behind. Arthur turned back to the executive team. We start over. Today. Miriam nodded, opening a thick binder. We will initiate a full system-wide audit, review every deceased customer's account, implement real-time fraud controls, and retrain every employee. Arthur looked at each of them, his eyes stern but warm. If any of you here feel you're not ready to do what's right, the door is open. But if you stay, we will rebuild this bank with honesty and respect, the way it was meant to be from the very beginning. No one left their seat. In their eyes, Arthur saw fear, shame, but above all, hope. As the meeting ended, Arthur remained alone in the room, looking up at the photo of his grandfather on the wall, the man who built Riverstone Trust with nothing but his bare hands and a promise to always protect those who place their trust in us. Arthur whispered, I let them break that promise, but I will make it right. Outside. The dark clouds were clearing, sunlight shimmering on the rain-soaked street, glinting like a reminder. News of Lucas Graham's arrest and Richard Malone's suspension spread quickly throughout Riverstone Trust and the local community. Headlines hit the papers. Historic bank caught stealing from the dead. The phones in Arthur's office rang non-stop. Emergency meetings were held back to back. Arthur looked out the window, seeing his reflection, more silver in his hair, hollower cheeks, but eyes that still burned. On a rainy afternoon, Arthur walked into the Riverstone West branch. All eyes turned to him, filled with worry, guilt, and hope. Clara Lewis stood at the counter, holding a stack of customer files. She saw Arthur and gave a small nod, her eyes tired but steadfast. Arthur stepped forward, his voice warm. "How are you, Clara?" Clara offered a trembling smile. "Every day we keep going, Mr. Arthur, for Henry, and for those who believe in this place." She paused, tears welling in her eyes, her voice dropping. "I'm ashamed I didn't speak up sooner." Arthur placed his hand over hers, looking her directly in the eyes. "You are not the one at fault. The fault lies with those who took advantage of the silence of good people." Arthur requested all employees of the branch to gather in the main lobby. Rain pattered against the glass roof, water streaming down, catching the glow of the yellow lights. He stood before them, without reports, without papers, only the truth. "I know these past days haven't been easy for you. I know many of you are afraid for your jobs, your reputations, and the future of this branch." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across every face, young and old people who had dedicated years of their lives to this bank. "We have failed to protect those who trusted us, their money, their faith. The trust they placed in us has been betrayed." A soft sob broke the silence from the corner of the lobby. A young teller wiped away her tears, whispering, We didn't know this was happening." Arthur nodded. "I believe you. I believe that most of us here want to do the right thing." He paused again, his voice slow and firm. "Starting today, we will begin to make this right, beginning here." In the early days following the reform, the atmosphere at Riverstone West remained tense. Customers eyed the staff warily through the glass, and employees stiffened when customers asked the hard questions. Can this bank still be trusted? Arthur watched all of it in silence. Every morning, he walked into the lobby with a cup of black coffee, observing each transaction, each exchanged glance, each hesitant smile slowly turning genuine. One morning, Clara Lewis was guiding a young employee through a transaction for an elderly man whose hands trembled. The man pulled out a stack of old bills, counting them one by one. "This is my pension. I want to deposit it, but I'm afraid." His voice caught, eyes lowering to the floor. Clara gently placed her hand over his, offering a warm smile. "Please don't worry, sir. Here, every single dollar will be protected. We will guard it as if it were our own family's." The elderly man looked up at her, tears welling in his clouded eyes as he nodded. "Thank you, thank you." Arthur watched from a distance, his heart aching but also warming. These were the moments that defined why a bank should exist. At the quick service counter, Jennifer, once cold and curt, was now patiently explaining to a young mother how to transfer tuition money for her child. Jennifer's voice was softer, her eyes no longer avoiding contact. "Don't worry. I'll explain every fee. If you don't understand anything, just ask, and I'll help you check whenever you need." The young mother smiled, hugging her small child beside her. "Thank you. You're so sweet." Jennifer blushed, but her eyes shone with pride. During a small internal meeting, Arthur sat with Clara, Jennifer, Kevin, a young teller, and Miriam. Kevin spoke softly, his voice trembling. "Mr. Arthur, before. I thought this job was just sitting here counting money. I never realized. Each of these dollars represents someone's trust." Arthur nodded, his eyes softening. Kevin, "Trust isn't something easily earned. But if we keep it, we'll never have to fear losing this job." Kevin clenched his hands, nodding. "I understand now. I'll do what's right." Miriam looked at Arthur, offering a rare smile. "See, Arthur, they're changing." Arthur remained silent, watching the young faces discussing how to better serve customers, how to detect suspicious transactions, and how to clearly explain fees. That afternoon, Arthur stood in the lobby as Clara taught a group of employees how to check the transaction systems. Her voice was clear, warm, yet firm. "Every transaction is a story. Never forget that." One employee asked, "But what if we find something wrong with a co-worker's transaction?" Clara didn't hesitate. "Then you report it, because if you don't, you become part of that wrongdoing." Arthur nodded internally. This was the spirit the bank needed, to never remain silent in the face of wrongdoing, to never turn away from those who placed their trust in them. As customers began leaving the bank, they started saying thank you. An elderly woman paused, holding Jennifer's hand. "Thank you, dear, for being patient with me." A young father leading his child turned back to wave at Kevin. "Thanks for explaining everything to me. I feel at ease now." Kevin smiled, waving back, his eyes bright with a pride he had never felt before when he walked into the bank. Arthur turned to Miriam, his voice low but relieved. "We've begun to heal." "Miriam." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "Yes, Arthur. And they're the ones teaching us how to start over." Outside, the sun set, casting gold over the streets, its light filtering through the bank's windows, illuminating smiling faces, hands exchanging money, and warm glances shared between people. Arthur stepped outside, taking a deep breath, the evening breeze carrying the scent of trees and the familiar smells of the city. There will be much to do tomorrow. But today, at least, this bank has begun to live again. That morning, Arthur arrived at the branch lobby early. The air was crisp, a thin mist covering the windows, droplets forming and sliding down like silent tears. He stood by the reception desk, watching each employee begin their day. Clara, wearing glasses, meticulously organized customer files. Jennifer plugged in the scanner, checking last night's transaction logs. Kevin wiped down the counter, adjusting his name tag with a seriousness he had never shown before. Arthur stepped into the center of the lobby, speaking softly. "Everyone, please, gather around." They stopped, surprised, then gathered around him, eyes waiting. Arthur pulled a small wooden plaque from his coat pocket, hand-carved with bold lettering. "We honor every customer who trusts us. We promise no one will be forgotten." He raised the plaque, his voice low but warm. "I want this hung at the entrance, so that everyone who walks through these doors knows this place doesn't just keep money, it keeps trust." Silence fell. A young employee's eyes welled up, whispering, We're really starting over." Clara placed her hand on his shoulder, nodding. "Not starting over, doing it right." Arthur continued, "I also want to announce starting this month, the bank will allocate a portion of its profits to establish the Henry Lewis Fund." Everyone turned, surprised, looking at Clara. She stood still, her hands trembling as they covered her mouth. Arthur looked at her, smiling. "This fund will support elderly customers, those who are ill, and customers in difficult situations, ensuring they receive financial guidance, safe banking services, and that no one is left behind." Clara broke into tears, streams running down her cheeks. "Henry. He would be so happy." Arthur stepped forward, taking her hand, his voice soft but resolute. "This is the real legacy, Clara, not the numbers, not the big buildings, but the people we protect." A week later, the ceremony to hang the plaque and announce the Henry Lewis Fund was held in the lobby, attended by customers, employees, and local reporters, in front of the cameras. Arthur stood beside Clara, her hand resting on the wooden plaque, tears in her eyes, but her gaze firm. Applause filled the room as the plaque was mounted, reflecting the sunlight streaming through the windows. After the ceremony, an elderly man approached Arthur, leaning on his cane, his clouded eyes lighting up with hope. "My daughter passed, leaving 2 young grandchildren. I don't know how to withdraw my pension to support their schooling. Can this bank help me?" Arthur bent down, taking the man's hand. "We will help you. From today, you don't have to be afraid anymore." Clara stepped forward, her voice gentle. "Let me take care of this for you." The old man looked at her, tears spilling over. "Thank you. Thank you." That day, Arthur sat in his small office, looking out into the lobby. He saw Clara patiently guiding the elderly man through each step of the deposit slip, Jennifer smiling as she showed a young boy how to send online savings to his grandmother, Kevin helping a single mother open a tuition savings account for her child, explaining each detail clearly. Arthur smiled, a gentle, warm smile. He knew the spirit his grandfather instilled in this bank had returned, where every dollar was respected and every customer protected. That evening, Arthur left the branch as twilight descended. Street lights reflected off the rain-slick pavement, shimmering on the sidewalks. He stopped, looking up at the wooden plaque by the entrance. placing his hand on the carved words. "We promise no one will be forgotten." He whispered, "Grandfather, I understand now. A bank isn't just a place to keep money. A bank is where we protect trust and human dignity." Arthur turned to walk away, but the heaviness of the past days was gone. He knew the road ahead would be long, filled with challenges and trials, but he was no longer afraid, because he was not alone. He had Clara, employees who were changing day by day, customers who still believed in goodness, and above all, he had a true legacy, the trust of the people he was protecting. A month after the plaque was mounted, the atmosphere at Riverston West was different. Soft laughter mingled in conversations. Thank you was spoken more often, and the eyes of employees meeting customers no longer darted away, but showed genuine care. That morning, Arthur walked into the branch, holding a cup of hot coffee, moving slowly between the waiting chairs. He saw an elderly woman struggling with a deposit slip, her eyes moving slowly across the words, her hands trembling. Jennifer quickly stepped forward, bending slightly, smiling. "Let me help you, Mom." The elderly woman looked up, a rare spark in her clouded eyes. "Thank you, dear. I can't read it clearly." Arthur stood, watching, a warm feeling spreading in his chest. He stepped forward, placing his hand on Jennifer's shoulder. "Thank you." Jennifer turned, smiling, her eyes shining with pride. "I'm only doing what we promised, Mr. Arthur." At the quick service counter, Kevin was showing a young father how to deposit tuition money for his daughter. "Don't worry, sir. This money will go straight into the tuition fund. If there's any problem at all, you can call me directly." The father gripped Kevin's hand, his eyes glistening with tears. "Thank you. My wife passed away, and I don't want my daughter to drop out of school." Kevin nodded, his voice firm. "Don't worry, she won't be left behind." At the consultation desk, Clara was carefully organizing paperwork to help an elderly man who had just lost his wife and didn't know how to withdraw survivors' benefits. She listened patiently as he shared stories of how he and his late wife had scraped and saved every penny, his voice trembling as he spoke of her. Clara held his hand. "Don't worry, sir. We will help you withdraw those funds safely." She would smile, knowing you're still living bravely. The elderly man lowered his head, tears dripping onto his age-spotted hands. "Thank you. Thank you." That afternoon, Arthur called a small internal meeting. Everyone gathered around the old wooden table, the room quiet but warm. Arthur looked at each face, people who had been through fear and crisis and were now changing, day by day. "I know it's not easy to stand up after someone else's mistakes, but you've done it." He paused, his eyes misty. "I want you to know I am proud of you." Miriam stood beside him, nodding, her voice catching. "We're not just doing banking work. We're protecting those who can't protect themselves." Kevin raised his hand, his voice shaking. "Mr. Arthur, I used to think this job was boring, but now I understand every person who walks through that door carries their story, and it's our responsibility to listen," Jennifer added, her eyes shining. "I'm no longer afraid to look customers in the eye. I want them to see our sincerity." Clara squeezed Arthur's hand, her voice hoarse with emotion. Henry would be so proud. Arthur, I am, too. Arthur took a deep breath, his voice carrying in the quiet room. This is the true legacy of this bank, not the numbers on reports, but the grateful eyes, the hands we hold, and the lives we protect. That evening, Arthur left the branch, stepping into the street lit by soft lights. He looked up at the star-filled sky, his eyes reflecting hope. Tomorrow we'll begin again, and we will do it right. He knew this journey was far from over. There would be more challenges, more obstacles, but he no longer felt fear. Because now, this bank was no longer just a financial institution. It had become a place that protected trust and human dignity. 6 months had passed since Arthur had been thrown out of his own branch by his employees. 6 months since a moment of deep humiliation transformed into a quiet but powerful revolution, reviving the soul of the bank his grandfather had built. That morning, Arthur walked into Riverston West wearing a simple coat and a faded fabric cap. But this time, there were no suspicious stares, no cold shoulders. Instead, there were smiles, warm eyes, and greetings. "Good morning, Mr. Arthur. You're here early again today." He stood in the lobby, looking up at the wooden plaque. "We promise no one will be forgotten." Beneath the plaque were thank you letters from customers, people who once felt scared, powerless, insignificant in the eyes of the bank, but now felt heard and protected. Clara walked over, holding a stack of files, her eyes as steadfast as ever. "We just helped an elderly woman complete her pension withdrawal paperwork. She cried with relief." Arthur nodded, smiling. "You're doing a great job." "Clara." She looked at him, her eyes glistening, her voice trembling. "No, Mr. Arthur, we're doing a great job." Today, he understood it was a blessing wrapped in the disguise of a trial. Without that day, he would never have seen how far the bank had strayed from its core values. Without that day, he would never have witnessed how people like Clara, Jennifer, Kevin had grown and become quiet warriors, protecting customers day by day. He whispered to himself, "A true legacy isn't a big, powerful bank. It's a bank built with kindness." If you've ever believed that only big actions can change the world, remember a caring look, a simple, "How can I help you?" or a patient ear can save someone who feels alone, afraid, and ready to give up hope. And if you're in a job where you serve others, never forget you hold the power to change the world, one person at a time.